Yeah.
I'm going to go get some pineapple. Hi, Renee. Good to see you.
Hi, it's good to see you. Happy Friday from Australia.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a different day in Australia.
Yes, we're in the future here. We are in the future.
So how are things, going? Does tomorrow look like a good day for the world?
Yeah, it looks like a wonderful day because it's the weekend and weekends are just the best.
That works for me.
How is it for you?
So far, so good. I mean, and that's saying a lot since we're here. I'm here. Well, actually, Tom is here too in the United States. And, to say something is a good day is an increasing rarity.
Yeah. Well, we're about to go into our Australian election here, so I'm sure that you'll probably get some of that news over there. So that will be very interesting. That's happening tomorrow night. It will be decided. So we'll have a new prime minister, or maybe the same one. Who knows?
Well, listen, whoever it is, it has to be better than what we're going through here.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, I'm sending you some Aussie love and spirit.
All right, well, thank you.
we in Canada know.
Listen,
Well, yeah, you guys just had your election in Canada.
Well, yes.
What do you think of that?
The
In
good
Canada?
guys won.
Nothing good.
good.
Well, no, the election was good. The election was good, except our new prime minister didn't get a full
Majority.
he didn't have a full he didn't get quite the results he needed in terms of yeah.
Why is that?
Sorry?
Why is that? What's happening in Canada that he wouldn't get more votes on the Labor side?
There's a lot of conservatives,
I don't believe it.
especially in the West. Ontario is the big place for liberals. In the West, it's conservatives, and in Quebec, of course, um, they've got their own parties.
Forgive me.
Also true, Alex, that Mark Carney, who is our prime minister,
Yes,
came in only a couple of months before the election
that's right.
when Justin Trudeau stepped down. So there was a very, very short period of time. Up until that time, it was a landslide for the Conservatives. So Carney pulled off an amazing turnover from a complete majority for the Conservatives to almost a majority for the Liberals. So it was quite a coup.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just
And
say, by the way, I just want to say hello to Tom and his hat in the upper right-hand corner, at least of my screen.
Hi, Paul.
Good to see you, Tom.
Thank you.
So listen, actually, it's 8:05, and we have actually a nice group of people. And actually, I was talking to Tom about an hour ago, and I said I thought we'd have 35 or more people. So it looks like we hit that right on the nose. So I'm very happy about that. So let's officially start this. First of all, let me say how happy I am that all of you are here. In terms of the global village, we have a pretty good representation. We have someone from Brazil, someone from Australia, someone from Poland. We may get somebody from China. And then we have everyone else from the US and Canada. On that, let me just point out that here in New York State, we would gladly become a province of Canada. But
We'd love to have you.
I'm sure.
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, well, you might have a good instinct on that.
Paul, I don't know why, but I'm not registering on the guest list. It's Michael McLuhan here, and I can't seem to make Zoom put me into the gallery or anything. So just to let you know, I'm here, but I think I might be invisible.
Okay, well, you're on the list here where it
Oh,
says-
am I? Good. Okay.
I see, but I'm gonna just go make sure that your image is here. That's important.
Oh, no, it's not there. And I can't get any of the things to come up to help that out. So my wife's not here. I can't help you with the Zoom thing.
Okay.
Leave it at that. Anyway, I just wanted to say hello to everyone and greetings.
All right. Good to, I'll say just, good to hear you. Not good. Actually, that's actually significant because it's acoustic space, right? And, that was very important for Marshall. Let me just go over some very quick things about this Zoom session. I'm going to leave the written chat open so you can say whatever you want to each other. I mean, you can curse me out, whatever you want to do. But when we get to the questions and answers and during the actual interview that will take place before the question and answering time, I'm not going to look at the chat because I want to concentrate on talking to Tom. Any questions that you have, and Tom, by the way, is such a brilliant thinker, I have to give him all my concentration to understand what he's saying. So what you should do if you have a question is write it down. I mean, if you feel better about it, you can put it in the chat, but don't get upset if I don't say anything about it. And then when we go to our question and answer period, then you can ask those questions. So that's just one point I wanted to make. Another point is if you look at the top of the chat, you'll see a URL there. I don't know who put that in there, but somehow if you click on that, that will bring you to, I guess, the US Amazon page. Many of you live in countries where you have this brings you to the US page where you'll see all 3 versions of Tom's book at long last up for sale. So the Kindle, the paperback, and the hardcover. And let me mention that some of the prices for the paperback and the hardcover may seem a little high, but we're actually not we. The Connected Editions is actually going to raise the price of the paperback and the hardcover within 2 or 3 days. So now's a good time to buy either of those 2 books. And by the way, it's a worthwhile investment because the book, Tom's book, Wisdom Weavers, is so long that you can use it for a doorstop. Not like a tree that's like falling over, just put it there and then get another copy of the book and read it that way. So I think it's a worthwhile thing to get. So let's begin our conversation. And I want to start with something which actually I have really been thinking about a lot. Tom has been writing this book for at least 50 years. It's not an exaggeration. And look, I sometimes take a long time writing something, but 50 years is a long time, would be a long time even for me. So my first question for Tom is how and why, I guess that's really 2 questions. How and why did it take so long for you to write Wisdom Weavers?
Thank you. And first, it's a joy to be here, an honor to be here. And Paul is publishing the book, among other things. So I want to acknowledge a big shout out also. Michael identified himself to have one of Marshall's children, but not just anyone. Michael was key to the photography of this book and also advising me. Bob Logan has written the foreword and is with us. He was one of Marshall's co-authors. I could go on and on. Bill Buxton is here, who may be the leading authority on Innis, certainly one of them, who advised me throughout. And I'll acknowledge a number of other people later. I had several advisors on this. I see Phil Murray, he read through the book for me. And I want to thank several others. I see old friends. The way that this book started was I was an undergraduate at Harvard and they had no Department of Communication. and several other departments were missing. So students could put together a special concentration if they wanted to. And as I understand it, I was the first person to put together a special concentration on communication. And it meant cobbling together all kinds of weird things like, insect communication and the psychology of perception and the first course on computers, things that didn't ordinarily seem to fit together, but to make a special concentration. And I kept hearing from advisors and others, well, if you're going to do this, what about Marshall McLuhan? And others were saying, no, McLuhan is just kind of a rock star who's trading in on his ability to come up with clever catchphrases, but he's not a real scholar. He's more gibberish. But others were saying, no, he's genius. If you look at him as a rhetorician, and never mind the fact he doesn't document and isn't a so-called serious empiricist, he nevertheless has an art form of his own, and he has something to say beneath it. It's not just clever wordplay. And so I would get this conflict from my professors, genius or gibberish. And as I began to hear another name in the background from my faculty, it was, well, the real brain behind McLuhan is Harold Innis. Have you heard of Harold Innis? You better go read his work. And that wasn't from everyone. Not everyone had heard of Innis, not in the way they'd heard of McLuhan, who was a household name at that point, at least in the NPR kind of world or CBC kind of world. And yet, Innis was seen in two phases, genius, then gibberish, by the people who knew him well. Genius from the standpoint of being at the top of the economic history ladder in Canada and political economy and many other areas, economic geography, he was quite strong and beginning to be more senior. But in his later years, the work that he got into was less and less documented and more truncated and harder for the average scholar, or let alone average person, to fully decipher. And so there was a sense there that as he branched into communication, he was becoming more like gibberish. And so my doctoral thesis, when I went up to the University of Toronto, Harvard gave me grants to go find out if this was genius or gibberish. Now that was just on the surface. Obviously, I wanted to conduct interviews with all of the family as much as I could. Michael's family, Mary Dagg's family, who has been an advisor to me, the daughter of Ann Dagg, who was also an advisor, but not just the families. I also wanted to interview their critics, their champions, their co-authors, like Bob Logan, many other people who were very closely associated. Innis had passed on when I got to the University of Toronto. He died in 1952, and I wasn't there till 73. But some of his mentees, you might say, are associates or colleagues who took over the department for him or who were strong economic historians or historians, were still there. So I got to interview Donald Creighton and study with Tom Easterbrook and Vincent Bladen and others who knew Innis well. And out of that, I wanted to find out far more than what the percentage or ratio of genius to gibberish was, if that's even fair to either man, and to go deeper as to why they're so important, what's so important about communication as a discipline, what could we learn from them, if anything? Were their critics valid on any of the points they were making? Were their champions valid or just groupies? Was there some mixture of all of this? And out of this came a PhD thesis on which some of the people who either knew Innis well or knew the work about him well and McLuhan well, or the work about him well, sat on that thesis. And many people will tell you, and you'll know if you're a student listening in, and I see 3 or 4 of my former students here, thank you for being here, I appreciate it, that people will tell you, well, maybe you should convert your master's thesis or your doctorate to a book. But all that stayed on the back shelf because I had to go through getting tenured and all the steps everyone goes through and writing about other things. But I would continue to write a little bit on the side about Innis and or McLuhan and try to stay abreast of the literature. And finally, when I retired 3 years ago, I could begin to amalgamate all that had been written during that time, read a lot to catch up, including some of your work for those of you who are online, and begin to focus on what was still relevant in the thesis, which was maybe 40 or 50%, begin to hone down the rest of it, and start writing about everything that all of you have been writing as additional chapters, and also rethinking my whole position, because at this point, we're in the age of AI and the age of lots more media. And people would always ask me, as I'm sure they asked some of you, what would Marshall say about this? What would Innis say about that? And so I had to focus on that too. What's relevant? What's important? What can be applied? When all is said and done, were they right? If so, 100%, or to what extent? What are the important questions about media today? What would they want us to be doing if we knew that? Where's the field? What's this whole media ecology thing that seems to be one part that has a whole Canadian team, so to speak, with Bob on the masthead of an important journal, but also another important journal and association coming out of New York initially, but from the United States and many other places as well. What is all of that about, and where would McLuhan and Innis be in evaluating all that, and where are we at in evaluating that? But beyond all that, we're human beings. What does this mean for us as individuals? What does this mean for society collectively? What does this mean for a world where, before we even started today, people were talking about Trump and many other aspects of the current society? But I'd say, what are the eternal questions too? Do they have a place in intellectual history that makes them eternal torchbearers? Are there some of the big questions that we all ask that they can help to answer? So that's it in a nutshell. And Paul Levinson came along as a wonderful academic and creative partner. And here we are with a book. Thank you, Paul.
All right, thank you. That's it. There's nothing more to say. Thank you. Only kidding. I actually have another question, and it's a very recent question. As many of you know, because I've tried to promote this all over the known and unknown universe, just very recently, I had the pleasure, in fact, it was Tuesday evening, of attending a really moving event at the Players. It was organized by Lance Straight, and he would get crazy if I didn't say, and sponsored by the Institute of General Semantics. By the way, why is it the Institute of General Semantics, not the Institute for General Semantics? But I just want to point that out. I don't know. But the reason I'm mentioning this is it was a real treat to see a television show that was broadcast in Detroit on some godforsaken station way, way back in 1960. It was recorded on a kinescope. It was directed and produced by Gary Gumpert, and the event at the Players was really a memorial for Gary Gumpert. Sadly, he passed away just this past November. And one of the things that has been batted around for as long as I've known Gary and McLuhan is who came up with the title, The Gutenberg Galaxy. Now, if I asked all of you who came up with that title, you'd probably think, well, Marshall McLuhan came up with it. Well, Gary Gumpert once said to me point blank, he said, I'm the one who came up with the title Gutenberg Galaxy. This, I was going to say film. I don't know what it is exactly. It's some kind of something or other. It's not really film. It's like a recording of an early television presentation. And I have to say, it is a marvelous thing to see McLuhan in 1960. He was all of 49 back then. And he basically had, in this 30 minutes, all the ideas that he would then write in as many books and articles in the following 20 years, which unfortunately were as long as he lived after that 1960s television show. And all of the ideas were already there. He talked about the global village. He talked about Earman, which later would become acoustic space. But Tom, what I wanted to ask you is, as someone who has done this huge amount of research that coming out with this book, Wisdom Weavers entailed, first of all, do you have any testimony of anyone, either Marshall McLuhan or Gary Gumpert or someone else, as to who came up with the title Gutenberg Galaxy? Or do you think it's just something that history is going to say we won't have the answer to? As some of you know, this thing seems to happen all the time with different phrases. To this day, there is a debate and a big question mark over who created the name media ecology. Now, if you ask Neil Postman, unfortunately, we can't ask him anymore. He would say, I'm not sure, but I think I came up with it. But a lot of people would say that Marshall came up with it. Some people would say actually Eric McLuhan came up with it, Marshall's son. One thing that I know for sure is I didn't come up with it. That's for sure. I mean, I thought it was an interesting name, but no, I've come up with a lot of things, but not that. So, Tom, my question to you is, what insight or spotlight can you shine on that question?
Thank you, Paul. And you're speaking to a group of people who know Marshall's work, and I see a number of faces here who may need to know what the Gutenberg Galaxy was before we even make that assumption. So this was an important book that was written. We know Gutenberg is credited with inventing the printing press, although many others were involved. And Galaxy implies that something very large came out of that, all these titles, all of these forms of printing and so forth that came out of that. And so Gutenberg Galaxy was a much awarded book, seen by some as the best that he's ever written, seen by many as the first notable substantial book that he wrote in the 60s. And I don't know if we can know who wrote it for the following reasons. When you look at media ecology, several people claimed to have come up with it. And if you look at Lance's accounting, he thought there must have been a magical moment where someone said media ecology and everyone said media ecology. But in fact, as he tracked it down, he found out different people took credit and so forth. So I'm not sure. When you look at all of Ted Carpenter, who was one of his co-authors, testimonies about Marshall hearing a phrase, liking it, and then taking credit for it, or hearing a phrase, liking it, and then adapting it or adjusting it. And he was in literature studies, so that was done frequently. Many of the great artists would take from each other, and that was not considered stealing. It was considered a compliment in the field that he was in. So I think we have to have those two contexts. First, that borrowing was common and people would take credit for what they borrowed or get credit without meaning to for what they borrowed. But also that sometimes it's impossible to know, because if you look at the history of invention, many people invented the same exact machine or technology, but also phrase or idea thousands of miles apart or hundreds of miles apart without knowing the other person had done that. So all of that is to say there could have been many people, or there could have been people who took credit for it who didn't do it. And it could be as simple as, yes, it was Gary Gumpert, or yes, it was Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah, go ahead. Were you going to say something else, or was that it?
Well, I think the medium as the message is as well known as the Gutenberg Galaxy and the Global Village in terms of phrases associated with him. And I wanted to give everybody an experience of the medium being the message, rather than just going into depth about analyzing what that means. We all think we know what it means, but I would like everyone, so that we're not just talking heads for the whole time, to actually do something. Put your finger in front of your nose, wherever you are. No, we're not recording this for the guys in white jackets, but just close one eye and look at your finger. close the other eye and look at your finger. Now,
Tom, can I just interrupt you for a second? As long as we're doing this, I think I've muted everyone except you and me, and there's some kind of noise since this is like an experiential thing. And so as part of this experience, we're hearing this, like, I don't know, like some kind of rustling. So, I mean, is there something in your computer that's doing that?
while I'm talking, there is a wind in the background, Paul. I would have to mute myself in order to close that out if it's coming from me. If everyone else could mute, it could be coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's not coming from me because I have all my windows closed. So,
Okay. In any event, close one eye and then another, and then back and forth and back and forth, and the finger will appear to be hopping back and forth. Everybody follow that? Put the finger right in front of your nose. And as you go back and forth, you'll appear to have motion there. That's part of what's called the phi phenomenon. It's not the finger that's moving. Keep the finger still. But as you close one eye and then another, you no longer have what's called binocular occlusion or depth. You have just one camera, so to speak. And when you're watching a film, that phenomenon in conjunction with the persistence of vision, if you stare at a light or the sun, you have a retinal after image, right? And that after image carries over from shot to shot. As you close your eyes, those are shots. The finger seems to be moving like a camera that's moving. And so McLuhan would note that this is something that's totally invisible to all of us when we're watching a movie. Now we have pixelation, digital, many other forms of video, but in his day, he would say, at 24 frames per second, you also have 1/48th a second of darkness in between those 24 frames. And so don't pay for a full movie, pay for half of it because half of it is darkness. Now, why is that? Because you have 24 shots like the pi phenomenon that I'm showing you. But if you were instead to start reading in the chat, your eye would not work in the same way at all. You have little slabs or clusters of phonetic abstractions that are like the rows of tombstones in Arlington Cemetery or wherever you are in the world. There are military cemeteries that have very precisely ordered rows. And so your optic nerve is doing something totally different when you're reading. And it's doing something totally different when you were watching television in his day. He said the eye is like a finger because it had to move across the BBs that were being shot out of the cathode ray in that time. Now, what does all that mean? It means that we're seduced and sucked into the plot of what we think's going on with the media, the content, whereas in fact, the content is being totally transformed by the medium. The medium has more power than the content or the form, but also the medium can change the content. He did an experiment with Ted Carpenter and others where they took a best-selling book called The Caine Mutiny, and the hero of the book was a young ensign who was going to sea, but when it became a movie, the hero was the US Navy because of the scale of seeing a widescreen in a theater. But then when you put it in the theater, it's about the drama. And so the hero becomes the defense lawyer. And then when you put it on TV, a totally reductive medium in his day, it becomes about only the primary characters. You have to strip away subplots and other things. So the medium transforms the content and it transforms the message, but it also transforms society. And that's where we get into Harold Innis. Harold Innis would note in this day of artificial intelligence and so forth, that we're missing all kinds of things when we go to AI, such as that the data centers, and I see my friend Jay Solomon is on the call, the data centers are going to absorb so much water and electricity, it'll change the whole pricing system. But then that forces us to go to nuclear in the future, and people don't perceive that 3 Mile Island's coming back online. In other words, all kinds of resources are changed whenever we change a medium as well, and the needs for those resources and the economy surrounding that. So Innis is saying that whatever technology we introduce changes society in invisible ways, as well as visible ones. And McLuhan is saying it changes us in ways we don't perceive how we're using that optic nerve or the two hemispheres of our brain, or we don't think about our retinal response to what's going on. But if you're only reading, you're more stooped on the average by the time you get to 80 years old than if you're only watching screens, in which case we have done research to understand that we may be losing our eyesight a little quicker than people who don't use screens in society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are the unintended effects? So I just wanted to go there because the pi phenomenon and the persistence of vision are just one example of what's actually happening to us and through us when we're being mediated or electrocuted, so to speak, which we are in a world now where we have more screen interaction than human interaction. I hope that's something to think about. The medium as the message isn't just a cliche.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. You mentioned AI, and obviously this is something that's on everyone's mind, and certainly more so than in the past. Pretty much beginning a couple of years ago, when, as I'm sure many of you know, a group of highly expert AI scientists got together and issued a statement in which they said the world should be concerned because AI is on the verge of taking our lives over, going beyond a point where it might interfere with our very humanity. And, to me, that statement reminded me of like the Union of Concerned Scientists, who back in the 1960s issued a similar statement about nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people equate AI today with nuclear weapons, which I think is a ridiculous comparison. And, obviously there is a dangerous part to AI. If you've seen the Terminator, AI results in someone knocking at your door, "Where's Sarah Connor?" But the truth of the matter is, AI does a lot of different things. And I'm, among the people who think actually AI today is a lot like electricity was back in the 1870s and 80s. It's going to become a part of our lives. It does have dangers, but this chorus, this Greek chorus of warriors about AI is certainly something that I don't agree with. But Tom, my question to you is based on your study of Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innis for that matter. But I assume Harold Innis didn't talk much about AI or had much to say about what something like AI would do. But Marshall McLuhan, obviously, he's writing in the 1960s and 70s where there was a beginning of AI being used in various, super big computers. Of course, we now have more power in our phones than those computers back then. But Tom, what has your research told you about what Marshall McLuhan might have to say about AI here in the year 2025?
Thanks for asking. And by the way, I see our friend David Nosbakken online. He's very big in his foundation about digital literacy, and I think we need AI literacy. In some cases, it will diminish the fear, and in other cases, it will allow us to keep up with what's going on in our world. And in still other cases, and I would think David would agree with me, that it allows our young people for whom AI is the new normal to understand that there are other normals or that there are other ways of perceiving. So I see three dimensions to AI. I see the new normal, the things that we tend to take for granted, and I see the Colossus, the four-band project fear that AI will take over and run us. And I also see the unknown dimension, and I call this sorcery. The concern is with two kinds of sources, that is SOURCEY, that we no longer will know who our sources are. And increasingly that's the case. We no longer know if we're getting direct information from a human or if we're getting it from something that's been concocted and so forth. And the other form of sorcery, the sorcerer's apprentice, you recall, couldn't stop. The sorcerer's apprentice learned only part of what the sorcerer knew. And he was able to get the mops to do all of his work for him, but then he couldn't stop it. And I think that's the third dimension that people are concerned about sorcery, that it will be runaway, it will be irreversible, the unintended effects will be unstoppable and so forth. Now, what would McLuhan say about that? Well, he was concerned always with being clever with a double or triple meaning. And so looking around, people could use the phrase, the inmates are running the asylum now. But I think he'd say the automates are running the asylum. In other words, automation is not just the new normal, but it is the rule rather than the exception. And so the automates are running the asylum means that we're paying less and less attention to the authority that we delegate. And by the way, Innis would be very concerned about delegating authority to that which is taking over and therefore making us more mentally lazy and so forth. But I think also, in addition to the sorcery issue, we have the Pinocchio issue. And McLuhan loved to take well-known stories and invert them. And so we know Geppetto was the puppet master, but now with Pinocchio taking over and Geppetto being the puppet, we have the growing nose of disinformation. And that growing nose of disinformation may be unstoppable and irreversible. Just as we were concerned about the information society, now the disinformation society. And because it's Pinocchio, there is that point at which it becomes alive. Pinocchio wanted to be a little boy and so forth. And the technology around us, as we talk more and more to scientists, is coming closer to volition, will, and motivation. And at a certain point, it is the little boy and the puppet master and disinformation explosion all at once. So I can see McLuhan adopting stories, fables, allegories, word pictures like that, and also saying politicians no longer have running mates, they have automates. In other words, that running mate will be replaced by all of the campaign propaganda, which is automatically generated and so forth and so on. And I would see Innis also saying, you know, pay attention, not only to the hidden water, electric, nuclear interaction that he'd be monitoring for cost and for impact and for especially for monopolies. He'd be very concerned about monopolies beginning to take over. But he'd also be concerned about the fact we don't see what's really going on. When the Exxon Valdez spilled gallons and gallons and gallons of oil after Innis had passed away in my lifetime, all of the journalists were writing about the Exxon Valdez and how horrible this was and so forth. Innis would be noting that more oil was spilled by the journalist because ink is petroleum based than by the Valdez itself. In other words, what's really going on with our resources, what's really going on with our cultural geography, what's going on with our political economy is all changing by virtue of every medium and everything that happens. And we're looking at what McLuhan would call the big juicy steak that a burglar hangs in front of a criminal who's trying to enter a home. We're seduced by the plot. We're seduced by thinking the content is important. The oil that's spilled is important, but there's something else going on. And it's the infrastructure of society for Innis, but it's the hidden sensorial ratio for McLuhan and how that's changing us. Does that answer the question or begin to get at it?
It certainly begins to get at it. By the way, apropos all of these automatic things, I don't know how many people know about this, and I don't know if this was something that existed outside of New York City, but for many years in New York, there was actually a chain called Horn and Hardot's Automat. And what it was basically a place that you would go in, and it would basically have a series of like little compartments with windows on the front of them. And you would put a nickel or a dime in, and you would be able to get a piece of pie or a cup of coffee or whatever. This actually goes back to the 1930s, and it was a big hit in the Great Depression. But it just goes to show you that as far back as the 1930s and continuing through the 60s and 70s, this automatic business was very much on everyone's mind. But let me get to something else in your book, which is really in many ways the essence of your book, the relationship between Harold Innis and Marshall McLuhan. On the one hand, everybody came to know about that when McLuhan became famous in the 1960s. And, he said all of his work was just a footnote to Harold Innis's bias of communication. And at that time, it was like a very exciting thing to, find out, hey, McLuhan didn't just come upon this out of the clear blue sky. He, in a sense, was continuing a line of thought and reasoning that Harold Innis had begun. So what's your take on the intellectual relationship of Innis and McLuhan?
Thank you. I think that's one of the interesting parts of the book for most people who haven't done in-depth Innis and McLuhan scholarship, is that certain things happen between them that are underreported. For example, their first meeting was a huge argument about religion. Tom Easterbrook, who was McLuhan's best friend from childhood and who worked with Innis in the Department of Political Economy, introduced them at a place called Hart House at the University of Toronto. And his great fear was that they would talk about something other than communication. And indeed, McLuhan was a devout Catholic and very, as he called himself, as a convert, very zealous about that. And Innis was suspicious of any kind of papal authority, any kind of historically papal manipulations, the power of the church and so forth. And they hit upon the conversation of the Spanish Inquisition. So you can imagine how the sparks flew. But then another underreported, even though Bill Buxton and others have written well about it, area that most people don't know is the values group, where in 1949, they met and talked, and not only talked to each other occasionally, but also each made presentations. And the presentations were marginally about communication. McLuhan's was about the artist. And Innis, of course, was doing all kinds of work about the history of communication. And they began to see each other in different ways. No longer, this is my religious adversary, I need to steer clear of him, because Innis was an agnostic. And rather to see them as doing interesting work. And they began to write each other and say, oh, I'd like to, circulate what you sent to me among some other colleagues. And at one point, it was even suggested that they might start a school. Now, who's to say what was really meant by that? Because McLuhan was a professor writing a dean. So he might have meant you need a little money to get a school going, but he probably meant a school of thought. And there are a number of ways to interpret that, but people look back on it and say, these were the founders of the Toronto School of Thought, if you will, or the Toronto School of Communication Studies. People have added all kinds of words to that. What I think is important is what Kessler calls bisociation. Bisociation is when you creatively link ideas that weren't linked before, and creatively link, in this case, people who wouldn't be linked before. There's an apocryphal story about Gutenberg, since we're talking about Gutenberg Galaxy, about how printing began. And I'm not going to say whether it's true or false, only that it's interesting. Apparently, some flour fell on the floor, or something like meal fell on the floor, as did a child's block that had a letter of the alphabet in it. And when he picked up the block, Gutenberg noticed that it left a C or a D or whatever it would have been in his language and in his day. And the idea of printing something came from that. Two things that were not usually associated, flour or whatever it was that fell on the floor, and a child's toy, created a third idea. And Arthur Koestler became so enamored with that, he wrote entire books about the act of creation and so forth, and coined the term, at least we think he did, bisociation. What was so important about Innis and McLuhan is they were master bisociators. They read multiple books at the same time, and so they could freely associate things that other people hadn't associated and come up with interesting insights. And if you think about it, Innis and McLuhan themselves were bisociated. That is, when they began to hear each other, you had ideas from the social sciences coming in with ideas from the humanities or the liberal arts. And you began to have an urban creature with someone who was fundamentally rural in its values. And you began to have different kinds of things converging through the two of them that would create a third way of thinking, so to speak. McLuhan, enhanced by Innis, extended by Innis, was a different McLuhan than McLuhan before Innis. And the Toronto School, which spawned many of you on screen and many others, was a different line of thinking in intellectual history, because Freud and Jung had basically said, the subconscious is the message. That's where the power is. That's what changes us. That's what we're really motivated by. It's the subconscious mind. Marx and Engels had said in their own way, pardon the simplification here, the economy is the message. The class struggle boils down to money and to material goods and so forth and so on. Chomsky, the language is the message, on and on and on and on, or Worf and Sapir, the languages. And throughout intellectual history, no one had really said in this kind of strong way that both of them were saying in conjunction, but not saying it as a duet, but saying it through their writings. Communication implements of technology are the message. And then that becomes a term that Tom Wolfe said, McLuhan coined himself, the media. We can't be sure that he coined it, but Wolfe credits him. The media or the medium is the message. So all of that puts them in a different place in intellectual history. They're not doing what Freud and Jung did. They're not doing what Marx and Engels and on and on. Nietzsche said, power is the message. People live and are motivated by the accumulation of power. They had something very different, and that needs to be acknowledged, that despite all the other communication theorists, despite all the other communication thinkers, in conjunction, both subconsciously and consciously, they were saying, we need to pay more attention to what the implements of communication, Innis, or the media, McLuhan, are doing to society and to each of us.
All right, well, thank you. So, I mean, I think we can all agree that McLuhan was Jung at heart. But I also...
he said a young man is easily Freudened.
That's right. And, you know, it's interesting, though, because one of the real strengths of your book is the various incomplete, almost myths that have come down to us about Marshall McLuhan, the way that you, by bringing out the actual history, is correcting, you know, not the worst misunderstandings in the world, but nonetheless misunderstandings. For example, what we were taught in the media ecology program back in the 1970s was that basically there was no relationship between Innis and McLuhan until one day McLuhan was walking down the hall and he came by a classroom in which Harold Innis was teaching and posted on the door of the classroom, as was often done in those days, was the syllabus for that class. And I guess it was like late 1951 or early 1952. And on that syllabus, McLuhan was surprised and thrilled to find that his first book, The Mechanical Bride, was part of the curriculum for that course. But what you've just told us is they had a relationship that went back well before that and was much deeper and more interesting, I think, although that one, maybe it's even apocryphal story. That's all that we had from that. I'm just going to note that the time is 8:51, and I do want to leave time for questions. And I can see from the chat that a lot of people have questions, but I do want to continue talking with Tom a little bit longer. And in particular, well, two things. Actually, I do want to say one thing about artificial intelligence. One of my students, Nolan, who is here, sat through a lecture from another one of my students just a month ago, in which the other student talked about something called quantum computing. And according to him, quantum computing will totally replace AI and do things that are incredibly more powerful and impressive than the most that AI can do now. So I just wanted to make that note. But let me get to this question, give this question to Tom. As I mentioned, the 1960 Gutenberg Galaxy, I think, is a masterpiece because we get so much of McLuhan and his ideas pretty much completely formed as early as then. And probably the idea that he talks about the most, or as he would call it, the probe that he talks about the most, is the global village. And one of the things that struck me as soon as I began hearing about the internet was when McLuhan said electricity is turning the world into the global village. Well, that became a reality as soon as people began being able to log on and to an internet system, whatever it might be. And this very meeting that we're having is another example of that, with people from Australia, Poland, etc., Mexico. So the global village really is one of the key probes of McLuhan. But what do you have to say about that, Tom, in your book?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think most scholars and others would say it was a breakthrough image in many ways because it went public and it caught the attention of all kinds of celebrities and others who further echoed it. But I actually say in the book that there was no global village and there still isn't, by virtue of the fact, and this is not to take away from the power of the statement, that over 1 billion people in the world don't have electricity. And that even within highly populated regions, which are highly saturated with media, you have the Amish, you have old order groups, you have monasteries, you have lots of people who deliberately don't use media and who aren't connected. You have hermits, you have schools and cults which shun the media, you have countries with a very high censorship rate, and on and on and on. So the global village is a subset of the globe. And within that subset, you have a town or a village or whatever, but not the entire globe. And I think that's very important because it's easy for the privileged to assume everyone else is just like us and they just turn on their internet or whatever. And it's not just that many people don't have plumbing or electricity, but many have never seen an image on a screen. And so we make assumptions about the world. But that said, I think Innis and McLuhan would applaud that because that's independent thinking. We need to be independently thinking. And that's what they were doing, not groupies, not parrots, not people who throw their language around, but who consider the validity of what they're saying. And I think they would both want that and want to debate about things that we take for granted that they say that may not, in fact, be literally or even symbolically true. I want to say two things since we're coming to the end. I promised you that I would acknowledge a whole lot of people, and I just want to, I've acknowledged some of them that are on the screen, but I had many advisors, and if I don't get time to say it later, I just want to give a shout out because I've said something about Bob and David and Bill, But there are many others who were officially advisors. I mentioned Phil as well. Cam McLuhan read this very carefully for us. The people who were official advisors, Ted Glasser at Stanford, Bill, I mentioned, Cliff Christians at Illinois, the Innis family, Ann and Mary Dagg, the McLuhan family, Michael and Terry, Paulo Granata at the University of Toronto, David, I mentioned, at the McLuhan Foundation, Bill Coons, Post-Industrial Prophets, Lance Strait, Fordham, and B.W. Powell, who wrote a message that he'd love to be with us today, a very important Canadian poet and author from my standpoint. Terry McLuhan wrote some of the prefatory material, was always there to back me up. And I have to mention my wife, my daughter, the various editors, and my wife's very close at hand here. If I ever do anything right, it's because of her. So, and my two alma maters, Harvard and University of Toronto, both put a whole lot of money up. At that time, it was a lot of money for me to continue the research and so forth. So that I want to say. The other thing I want to say is what's relevant about this for us. I think many people could assume that they were determinist, and therefore we should all fear the end is at hand because the media is becoming even more powerful. But in fact, that's the story within a story. The larger story is that they both knew something else was larger than the media. For McLuhan, of course, it was God and all of the factors that other people might relate to, whether they call it the gods, fate, or supernatural. For Innis, it was nature, it was geography. That was the underlying cause of everything, and that too has a spiritual side or whatever. So the story within a story seems to be that they were determinists saying we will all be eaten alive by our creations. But the overall message beyond that is that we are creators, that humans have created media and not vice versa. And who or what created media, whether or not you're religious, spiritual, or whether you're evolutionist, something is a larger power than the media. And that gets out of the frame. The reason it's out of the frame is because man bites dog is a huge story. And what the media are doing to us that's undetected, that's a huge story. Everybody already knows, the dogs bite man. That's not the story. So that didn't carry any press. The fact that McLuhan believed there was something larger than the media and that he prayed daily and all of those other things doesn't get written in much. And the fact that Innis went on long nature walks and loved to get back to the farm and had this side of him that opened up very creatively to nature, and he could imitate all kinds of birds and all kinds of things like that. The side of him that also realized human civilization, as large as it was, as important as it was secondary to that which kept recreating it. The fur trade, everything else was controlled by geography. So I want to make sure that we have that message from them too, because it's the hidden one. And McLuhan talked about hot and cold media controlling us, but that's only true if you're asleep in the shower. If you fall down in the shower, yes, the hot will burn you, and yes, the cold will freeze you. But if you wake up and stand up, and McLuhan advocated that, he said we're somnambulists, we need to wake up and stand up. We need to see more clearly. We need to understand what these things are. And we need to have our own perspective on this, like the man in the maelstrom, who was caught in a maelstrom, who didn't go down in the maelstrom, where the others, out of fear, did go down to the bottom of the maelstrom. That's Edgar Poe's famous story. So I don't want to leave this with the usual same old, that they were determinist. I would say they were probabilist. And that was only the story within a story, the play within a play. And the larger one gives us much hope because we can create with the media, not just be created by it. And in fact, we're doing that right now with Zoom. So thank you.
Thank you. I just have one thing to add on this media determinist issue. I sent Marshall my dissertation before I even gave it to Neil Postman. And I got several phone calls from him. One phone call was great. Hello, Paul. Hello, Tina, my wife. Marshall, as if we didn't know who had that voice. And he said how much he was enjoying the dissertation. That, by the way, you can search for that. I have it up on my podcast. But what, for some reason, I guess, oh, I know what the reason was. That was recorded on like an old telephone answering machine when I was out of town. And so I had a recording of it, and I finally got it converted to digital. Shortly after that, though, McLuhan called me up, and I answered the phone. And he proceeds to say, you know, I really thought the dissertation is excellent, but you're completely wrong to say that Innis and I are media determinists. And he gave me an impromptu 20-minute lecture about why we were wrong. Of course, that didn't stop me from continuing to say that. But let me now actually turn this over to everyone who's been waiting so patiently. And if it's okay with you, we'll just keep this going as long as you folks want to keep it going and keep asking us questions. So the best
I
way.
have a question for Tom.
Okay,
Bob
yeah,
here.
hold it. That we'll
I'm
get.
holding it.
Thank you. I was just going to say the best way to do this is is to basically click on that little icon at the bottom of the screen where it says raise hand, because then I can easily go through all of you and see whose hands are raised. But go ahead, you can ask your question since you started asking it.
Okay. Tom, there would not be a media ecology movement if it wasn't for McLuhan. Innis was not a great communicator. Marshall McLuhan was. When I tell people about the fact that I work with McLuhan, they don't know the name. But I ask them, do you know the medium is a message? Have you heard of that? Oh, yes, I heard of that. The Global Village, have you heard of that? Oh, yes, I've heard of that. So Marshall McLuhan impact on our society was more than just on us scholars. Would you like to comment the contrast between McLuhan and Innis as communicators?
Absolutely. And you're bringing up a very important dimension, which is in the book and elsewhere, and which, Bob, I'm sure you're familiar with. And again, it's great to have you on the call, not just because of all you've done for the book, but all you've done for the Toronto School. So, yes.
Thank you.
You bet. Their difference as communicators is legion. As you know, Marshall went to Cambridge, where he studied Joyce and Tennyson and Nash, especially. He wrote his doctorate, and he became enamored with rhetoric. And rhetoric gets a bad name in the public sphere as being something that's overstated or overblown or just surfacey. But rhetoric is actually very important to the history of ideas and the way in which you can communicate. If you call a spade, Innis would be very happy because it's literally true. But if you call a spade a blade, people will pick up their ears and say, did he say what I thought they did? And McLuhan was a master at calling a spade a blade, at making us hear something in a different way. He loved word candy, you might say, instead of eye candy. And that had a tremendous impact, allowing him to, some say, popularize, others say make available or distribute some of Innis's better known later ideas. And the Staples thesis, which for Innis was basically that the environment and other things and what human beings do grow out of particular economies around staples. That idea, and by staples we mean major products within an economy and so forth, like the fur of beavers and codfish and so forth, that those can be seen as media if you have enough imagination and if you change the language. McLuhan came from such a strong rhetorical tradition that he had essays coming out constantly about many other English scholars. He wasn't just writing about the media. And those enabled him to keep an eye on what I call the invasion of the literary devices. He brought in personification and made each medium personified. He brought in the inverted cliche, though he's never quite humble. There's no police like Holmes, and many other inverted cliches. He had this capacity to combine simile, metaphor, imagery, all of those, the quip, the flip, at 80 miles an hour. He was a word acrobat and invented on the site. Innis came from a totally different language. He was unimpressed by all these young humanities professors who seemed to be seeking to impress with their exciting verbal repertoire. Innis called a spade a spade. He was a dirt empiricist. He wanted to see things backed up by data, even though he didn't have the time and energy to do that with all of his later work. He wanted to see hard facts. And he came from what McLuhan would call the dialectical tradition, which was the tradition in ancient Greece, dealing with primarily what we now call the social sciences. And so that kind of difference in background, having to back up everything you say, having to be very precise with what you consider to be the truth, rather than being colorful and imaginary and a satirist, which McLuhan was, very different approaches. So it would not surprise any of you to know that when McLuhan saw Innis, he described him as a Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes type. He called him, as deadly dull as Basil Rathbone and so forth, because he was a very strict empiricist and had a dour expression much of the time. And many of his friends loved it when he cracked a joke or smiled, because it was the exception to the rule. You can go back and read about all that in the book as well. But McLuhan was at the opposite end of the spectrum. So for McLuhan to be called, a fake or a flake because he was not documenting everything would be like calling a ballerina artificial for standing on her toes. His language stood on its toes as an art form. He was not concerned with flat-footed, natural walking. And Innis was. Anything that seemed fake, anything that seemed pretentious, anything that seemed to be adorning, he would much rather have the exact quote and the footnote or spend long nights in the archives. Bill Buxton can tell us about this. But Innis wanted it to be real. McLuhan wanted it to be literary, colorful, and therefore their communication styles were almost diametrically opposite.
I just want to jump in here and say I always liked Basil Rathbone. He had a great name and he had a really powerful presence.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's see some yellow hands, although you can make it any color you like, so I know who to call on. Otherwise, you'll have to suffer me asking Tom another question. And you had about an hour of that.
Oh, call on Fabiola.
Okay. Fabiola.
Okay, I don't know how to click in the. Okay, I am an analog person. All right. Good evening, Mr. Cooper. My name is Fabiola Balarati Quequeto. I am a researcher in communication and semiotics in São Paulo, Brazil, and I am also a translator. And congratulations to you and your editor, Paul Levinson, for your very careful and splendid work. I haven't read your book yet. I'm going to start early tomorrow morning for sure. But looking through the chapter 8, The Thought of Harold Innis, I found a very special and ludic way of dealing with the evolution of media in the atmosphere of that collision between Harold and Marshall, which is a sagacious dramaturgical bias with characters like, can I give a spoiler? I think so. I will just say 3 of them, my favorites. So Queen Tongue, King Paper, and Prince Radio. By the way, I thought your idea was brilliant, and I wonder if one day these characters could be turned into a cartoon so that maybe children of the millennial generation could learn where we came from before the internet those of us born in the last century. I also read on Amazon that your musical Higher will premiere in Honolulu in October this year, right? And that you not only love to swim, hike, write books, enjoy spirituality, but also develop theater, and that is great. So my question is, how did you go about creating these characters alongside the plot of the book? Can you tell us a bit about that backstage? Do you think dramaturgy can make a difference to the message? Thank you.
Obrigado, Fabiola.
Obrigada a você.
You found me out. I am a closet playwright, and I do have a play opening up here in Honolulu, and you're all invited. But I find, as a longtime teacher, and many of you are longtime teachers, and some of you are longtime students, that finding tools to convey complicated messages is much appreciated by students, especially students for whom English is a second language, but often by all students. And so for me to give one of several translations of both Innis and McLuhan as if it were a play, I've heard students say before, that really helped me understand what was going on. So what you're referring to there is that in part of my explanation of Innis, I say he has a dramaturgy. And the dramaturgy is like a succession of kings from Henry I to Henry II to Catherine or whatever. Only the succession is from clay to papyrus to print to radio, etc. King clay or queen print or whatever it is, each has certain powers because Innis has personified them. And if we see it that way, we also see all of the supporting characters, churches versus state all of the time. The university is the referee, the neutral that comes in throughout history. And it begins to simplify it. I'm always concerned with oversimplification, so I typically tell students, please read the original text. But with Innis, I never say, please start at the back and start reading his, his latter works. I think they need some kind of guide, such as Christian or Buxton have created as an entry point to the later Innis. And I think if I can empower them with some kind of way of saying, oh, I get it as they're reading. This is a succession of monarchs. This is a succession of dramatic characters, only instead it's a succession of technologies. That can be helpful. And the same is true with McLuhan. If you look through Understanding Media, he's going through a long lineage of monarchs too, who each have a kind of omniscient power for a while, and then they fade on the throne and they're replaced by someone with more power. And there are exceptions to that, and all of us scholars are qualified. But unfortunately, if you're like Innis, you can be seen as overqualified sometimes. Let me read you the passage that was originally "The medium is the message." This is Innis. We can perhaps assume that the use of a medium of communication over a long period will to some extent determine the character of knowledge communicated and suggest that its pervasive influence will eventually create a civilization in which life and flexibility will become exceedingly difficult to maintain, and that the advantages of a new medium will become such as to lead to the emergence of a new civilization. Now, that's a wonderful passage in some ways, and McLuhan always said, you know, there's so much to contemplate in just one sentence by Innis, and we can see it that way. On the other hand, for the average person, is that not overly qualified? I was taught to be a scholar. I was taught I had to constantly make sure absolutely everything I said was qualified within an inch of the literal truth in every way. And when you do that, you lose your audience. And so when McLuhan takes that very long passage and makes it the medium as the message, he loses a lot. But in terms of communicating, he gains a lot.
Correct.
Answer your question.
Yeah, let me just add, and as I'm sure most of you, maybe even all of you know, the medium is the message was just the beginning. It became the medium is the massage, the medium is the mess age. And I actually, you might find this hard to believe, knew at least one little thing about McLuhan that Tom didn't know. Because when I read that passage in his book, I said, well, you know, I once heard Marshall McLuhan say the tedium is the message. And we were around a dinner table when McLuhan and Eric visited us in New York. And we started talking about the medium is the message, and the medium is the message, and the medium is the message, et cetera, et cetera. And McLuhan and Eric looked at each other, and McLuhan said, oh, well, the tedium is the message, because they were obviously getting a little tired of just talking about the same thing over and over again. So it is a fascinating thing. And, you know, there was something about that statement, the medium is the message, that drove what I think of as like, you know, the old fashioned sociology origin, maybe, of communication and media studies departments. Of all of McLuhan's sayings, even hot and cool, they seem to understand these old school media theorists because they got the jazz analogy or whatever. But nothing enraged them as much as the medium is the message. You know, they would get really angry and say, so what? The content doesn't mean anything? And when you told them what Tom told you earlier, you know, about content being the juicy meat that distracts the burglar, uh, who is no, I'm sorry, that doesn't distract the burglar. The juicy meat is what the burglar throws down to distract the watchdog, and then you can go in and rob the house. So if you told someone that, you know, as sort of evidence that this is what McLuhan meant by the medium is the message, they would get even more angry. So I think that's a, you know, sort of an interesting facet of this history. You know what, though, I'm giving up on asking anyone to raise their hand.
Yeah,
'cause I
because
can
the
see that-
chime is not working.
Yeah, okay. So listen, and you're an acoustic audience,
Yeah.
so just scream out your question.
Okay. May I jump in with a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, I love the book, and I'm still trying to work on doing something with it, as you know, for as a review. But I'm just curious in hearing so much about it. You have been so close to the subject, you know, for so many years, and it's such a passion project. Was that harder or easier in writing this book? In other words, you knew McLuhan intimately because you were his assistant. Was writing a book on him, I mean, of course, you had an insider's knowledge that, say, someone who is not writing a book, you know, just from a third person was known, but did that, knowing him as well as you did that affect your objectivity, as it were, so, you know, so to speak? And what was your biggest surprise in writing the book and your biggest challenge? That's a three-pronged question, I know, but I'm just curious. Having just written a biography myself.
Yeah, those are three great different questions. So I think it was Peter Brook who was asked what it was like to play Lear when he was in his 20s versus playing King Lear when he was in his 50s. And it was totally different. He had matured so much, he had changed so much. He could feel the heart of King Lear when he played it as a middle-aged person. And as a younger person, he was just approaching it with, how can I do this part? And what have the others done with the part? What are the mechanics? Can I memorize these in a way that's convincing to the audience? My experience is somewhat similar in that I was very intellectually hungry and curious and so forth when I started to write the book. I wanted to learn as much about the subject matter as I could. But as an older person who, like most, are concerned about the meaning of life and about the ultimate questions, I'm looking at it from a totally different standpoint, such as look at the world and the situation it's in. Are there elements of truth here that may help us transform, that may help us educate? They were both primary educators, that may help the environment. And by the way, they were both closet environmentalists, and that may help us be deeper, more understanding, more reflective, more independently thoughtful human beings. So I'm looking at it in a very, very different way. And I would say that that means my greatest challenge is to convey that to other people, the greatest possible depth in here, rather than just the surface memory work. McLuhan had a lot of groupies and so forth who would parrot his favorite things back to him. Two of them once did that, and he said, if it isn't Tweedledee and Tweedledum, about two men who were very important to his work, but who basically were just recycling his favorite sayings. So I'm not concerned at that level anymore. I was concerned about really getting it right, really understanding it. There was a lot of complexity to both Innis and McLuhan, and I wanted to figure them out, study with as many people as I could, and go to as many sources, relatives, friends, critics, champions as possible. That's still important, but more important is the greatest ethical question of all time is our current world, our environment, and whether or not it can be saved. The great scientists say it's not a matter of if, but when, in terms of our resources and so forth. Given the big questions, what can we learn? What can be applied? And for me, it's personal empowerment, that I can see through the guises of the media, that I can better understand, and therefore be a creator more than just a consumer. And when you look at a world in which perhaps 70% of our consciousness is consumption, you have to ask, who am I beneath my programming? Who am I beneath all the trash, clash, flash for cash that I've consumed? A 15th century brain was asking and thinking about tomorrow and so forth, and what food am I going to have and how am I going to gather in my memories? A 21st century brain, if you could do an autopsy on it, would be 20% advertising, 15% porn, 15% news, 20% entertainment. If you look at the aggregate, I'm not saying any one of you has that exact proportion. And that means that the media has all kinds of power within our subconscious, not just our conscious. And so a more deep, important question for me is, can the person that I am underneath my programming think originally, express originally, and do something constructive and creative? Not just that Innis and McLuhan would be proud of, but that makes a difference in the world. That's very different than what I was thinking about when I was in my 20s.
Thank you, Tom. I believe it or not, I think I saw Joe Kennedy raise a yellow hand. So Joe, you have a question? Joe, going once, going twice. This is one of the problems with Zoom. Sometimes people walk away for. Okay. Joe, did you have a question? Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. You have to unmute yourself, Joe. All right.
You talking to me, Paul?
Yes, yes. I
No,
saw you.
I didn't want to ask a question. I was just testing if the raise hands and lower hands
Okay.
works. Sorry.
All right. But now that you have the floor, you don't want to ask an irrelevant question.
No, the questions have been above my pay grade for the most part.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Fair enough.
Very good ones, though.
Okay. I agree.
Well, if the answers are above your pay grade, keep in mind that Fabiola is suggesting a cartoon series to come out of this. And so maybe that would be a next step. And I'm not trivializing what she said. I think all of this should be available to people of every age and pay grade.
Bravo.
Yes, I agree with you. Actually, my daughter Molly, years ago, and we still may write this someday, was thinking about writing a book, McLuhan for children. But then we realized we have to make it even more radical, McLuhan for babies. And someday we'll write that book. And my guess is that babies will probably have a better understanding of McLuhan than most adults, at least in the decade since McLuhan started writing, have indicated. But who else has any questions? I don't want to cut anybody short. I know it's getting a little late. Although if you're out in California or, west of New York and certainly Hawaii, it's not that late at all.
Just so you know, Bill Coons is working on a McLuhan comic book, but he considers it more graphic than comic, but it's the same idea.
All right, good. Okay, Michael Grabowski's iPhone raised his hand. So Michael has like a very advanced iPhone. Go ahead.
That's what happens when your laptop dies. But it's really fascinating conversation this evening. So thank you very much for that. Given that you're putting on a live performance soon in Honolulu, and certainly through the writing that you've done, the value of human to human communication as opposed to mediated communication seems to come through. And so I have two questions. One's kind of a facetious question, one's a serious question. So what would you think about an Innis and McLuhan chatbot where you upload all of the writings of Innis McLuhan to AI and just have them exist in this disembodied form of probabilistic responses to prompts to it? Feel free not to answer that one, but more seriously, I'm wondering what you think they would have to say about the role of community, and community in the sense of people from different backgrounds and different opinions having to live together, of being in a single geographic place, and the relationship between that and what we're seeing today with polarization and people relocating geographically to people with like-mindedness and everything.
Thank you. Good question. Since I've spent maybe more time on McLuhan than Innis, I'm not sure that I have, but it feels like that. I want to say something about Innis and community. He favored the oral tradition. He loved the Greeks. He felt that students should be educated for character and integrity and honesty, not just for the particular discipline that they were in. And that was very important. And that when you become too biased in one direction or the other as a society, you've lost your balance. And so balance is very important to him for community and for civilization, which is community writ large. And I would say one of his most important thoughts that doesn't get a lot of airplay is his concern with the one-sidedness of communication. And he wrote Knight, one of his favorite colleagues, about this, and they agreed that the more you have implements of communication that multiply the number of recipients, the more one-sided communication becomes. And therefore, when Hitler gives a talk to millions of people, they can't all reply with their independent opinions, nor does he want them to, or for that matter, Roosevelt with the fireside chat. The larger the outreach of the implement becomes, the more one-sided it is. Whereas in Greece, someone speaks and someone speaks back. Now we know that's romanticized because there were slaves who couldn't speak and women who couldn't, and all of that. But the ideal was that in the oral tradition, people could have their own debates, their own dialectic, their own community oral convention, and that we were steadily losing that to the one-sidedness of communication. So that would say from Innis's standpoint that he's very concerned about restoring the balance, about preserving the oral tradition, about community having a face-to-face quality to it, and about anything that tends to play into the hands of monopoly or dictatorships should certainly be counterbalanced, if not shunned. Is that part of an answer, just coming from Innis's perspective?
Yeah, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Let me just add that Michael Grabowski, I keep saying this to Michael, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You are one of the final graduates of the Media Ecology PhD program. That's correct, isn't it?
Terry Moran was the chair of my dissertation committee. I at one point had Neil Postman as my chair briefly. Christine Nystrom was my chair briefly. And as I kept changing topics, I kept getting passed off. Say, well, this Terry's actually the expert in this area. So yes, absolutely. That was finished. I started the master's program in 94. I started the PhD program in 96, and I finally finished in 2006 because I was going back and forth working in film production and finally decided to finish up.
That's great. So I'm really glad you came by tonight. And that was a great. Actually, your first question, may have been facetious, but it is a very interesting question. I'll answer it a little bit. My experience when you ask these, chat bots and so on to do things is very often they do a terrible job. So again, this idea that somehow they're going to fool all of us. For example, try getting one of these things to do an index, and you'll see that they don't do a very good job. They not only leave out names, they make up names. So there's a dissertation actually right there investigating why these chatbots do those kinds of things. But thank you, Michael. Any other questions for Tom?
I just want to suggest that the chat is quite full. And if you haven't been following it, there are many great comments that come from many fine friends, some of whom have had to leave. You might want to read through to get other points of view and voices that we haven't heard.
Well, no, I think what I'll do though, I don't, like reading something that somebody wrote and they're not here to respond to any questions. What will be the case is this interview is going to be uploaded by me to YouTube sometime tomorrow. And I will have a transcript of actually the conversation, and I will have a transcript of the chat as well. And people will be able to read the questions that way. So at this point, we've been going for, 90 minutes, and I'll be happy to entertain any additional verbal questions. All right, well, listen, thanks everyone for coming by. You know what the way to get Tom's book is. I guess I'll just put this here one more time at the bottom of the chat. So it's at the beginning and end of the chat. And it was great meeting many of you. And, it was great seeing some of you who we haven't seen each other in many years. I'm trying to think, Bob, when was the last time we saw each other? That's not that long ago. It was maybe like 5 or 6 years ago in Toronto. Bob?
Bob disappeared.
Okay. All right. So listen, I'm going to say.
Paul, excuse
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Can you also put my email in the chat, or I can do it? I just want to let people know this isn't just about books. It's about, and it's been brought up, community. So I'm
Go
very
ahead.
happy to make new friends or to answer questions or to hear your ideas.
Go
So
ahead. Put it in. By the way, Tom Klinkelstein, I first met Derek DeKirkove when Tom introduced me to, not Tom, wait, hold on a second. Yeah, actually 2 Toms. When Tom introduced me to Derek, that's right. And it was in a restaurant right across the street from the new school.
All right.
In the village. Remember that? That's right. The food was pretty good, yeah. And then you went up to my classroom with me, and we had a good time. Okay, so we have Tom Cooper's email at comcast.net. All right, so thank you again, everyone. And I'm sure we'll be in touch in one way or the other. Thank you for everyone who enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed all of your questions, and I enjoyed talking to Tom about this as well. And just so you know, stay tuned. This is obviously the kickoff of a whole series of events that Tom is going to do. He's going to be on a bunch of podcasts, and I will be telling the world about those and giving you enough time to get onto those. He'll be doing interviews in all kinds of places, and some of those will be available through Zoom, others will be live, etc., etc. So all of you, I look forward to seeing you again in one or more of these events.
Thank you very much, Tom, Paul.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. To
Thank you,
all my
Tom.
friends who I couldn't give shout outs, I care about you. Thank you for being here.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.